The Straw Dragon. I spent the rest of the day watching Nick as he collected bits of fallen wood from the edge of a nearby forest and chopped it up for firewood. I'm allowed to take this much and no more, he told me. Just enough to fill my car, which is why I pressed it down as flat as I can. He scooped up a load and spread it out, grunting with the effort. It's hard work, this. Makes you nice and warm, though. I'll say that for it. Have a go. I shook my head and put my hands behind my back. At home, it was Ned Porritt's job to chop wood, when he wasn't seeing to the horses. I used to try and help him when I was much smaller, and he would bend over me, cross-eyed with concern if I got a splinter in my hand. But Aunt Carol had forbidden me ever to do the work of servants. Nick didn't seem to mind that I didn't help him. He chatted away to me non-stop, pausing every now and again to wipe the sweat from his face with the hem of his shirt. At last he had finished with chopping. He piled the firewood up onto a cart and took it round to the neighbouring cottages. The women there gave him cheese or apples in exchange for an armful of kindling. Grandma will be glad of these, he said. She'll store some of them up in the loft if we don't eat them, or before we get home. Here, have us some of this. He bit into an apple, sucking back the drawl of juice on his lips, and offered it to me. I shook my head. I didn't want to be here doing any of this. I wanted to be on my way to Lord de Cressy's. But it was nearly dark already. I had no idea what to do or where to go. So I trailed after Nick, and when one of the cottage women shouted at me to help her carry her load of wood in, I turned away, my face burning, and ignored her. He's sick, Nick explained cheerfully. Grandmum's looking after him. The woman peered at me. Doesn't look too sick to me, she muttered. Looks well fed enough anyway. It's his head that's sick, Nick said. He's pinning. We didn't go back to Nick's cottage until evening, and my feet were sore with trudging after him, and my head was sore with his prattling. I wanted to be on my way to Greenwich straight away now, but he kept saying, Tomorrow, tomorrow. You're learning to be a common boy, and I'm thinking how to help, sire. I had to believe him. I was too afraid now to go anywhere on my own. If the king's men had gone to Hampton Court, they would know I was missing. There would be a search on for me. I was sure of that. I might still be recognised even in my poor boy's clothes. Maybe it was better, after all, to lie low for a day, as Nick had suggested. But it was a long day, and the afternoon had brought sharp rain that soon dribbled through the thin shirt I was wearing and dripped through my cap and over my face. I was glad when Nick's cart was empty of firewood at last. Done, he said, wiping his dirty hands on his shirt. Come home with me for a bowl of Grandmum's stew. And welcome, sire. Nick's cottage was dark and draughty, till he got a good fire going in the middle of the room. The house filled with choking smoke at first, sparks flew and spluttered and then settled down, and the room filled with the sweet smell of burning applewood and pine cones. Cover the windows now, Grandmum Susan called out. Keep the wet wind outside where it belongs. The flaps of rags were pulled down, and then it was a cosy enough place, and made me think of the hall at home, that was so much smaller and didn't have the big woolen hangings to keep the draughts away. Gradually shapes loomed out of the shadows. The flickering light from the fire showed the contents of the room clearly now. At one end the milk cow munched thoughtfully, and around her in the straw and perched upon the beams of a half-dozen scraggy hens crooned to themselves. At our end there was a table and 3 stools, a box chair, a chest, and a straw mattress pushed against the dresser by the wall. A wooden ladder led up to the sleeping area, which was like an open-ended shelf jutting out over the cow's half of the room. The woman who had been laying out the washing that morning with Meg wasn't their mother, as I'd thought at first. Nick told me she was called Sarah Downey and lived nearby in one of the other cottages. She sat by the fire with us, feeding Nick's baby brother Arthur. He gave quick, satisfied gasps as he sucked, and she hummed quietly to him. She never took her eyes off me, yet she wasn't looking at me, not properly. She looked as if she was dreaming, awake. Widow Susan placed a big cooking pot on some stones in the middle of the fire, and after a time the liquid inside it began to bubble. She threw in some bones that had a few knobs of meat on them and a handful of vegetables that she and Meg had been chopping. Onion next, she muttered, some parsley and a bit of tasty lovage for flavour, some oats to thicken, and we'll eat well tonight. She grinned across at me, showing her wet bare gums. You don't eat as well as this where you come from, I'll be bound. When we've been hunting, we have plenty of meat, I told her, shocked that she should think I was used to such poor food. Venison and plenty, and there's always good roast beef and plenty of carp and salmon. My voice tailed off. I saw that she was laughing at me. What else? Meg asked dreamily. I should like to eat that. Her grandmother chortled again. They have so much to eat their bellies can't take it. That's what I've heard from the kitchen boy I met from one of those big mansions. They eat so much it makes them vomit. Sometimes, I said. I felt uncomfortable now. Some people do. She clicked her tongue. Well, most of England starves. She spat into the fire. Shame on them. Shame on all of them, lords and ladies. I hate them all. Go on, Meg smiled at me. Do they eat sweet things too? I nodded. Apricots and figs and honey cakes and sometimes sugar shapes. Sometimes a whole meal is made out of sugar shapes, made to look like swans or castles or ships, piled with cherries and apricots. She sighed. You should taste my peas pudding and wet suckers, then you'd know good food, the grandmother muttered. You want nothing better than that. Our king would grow fat on that and not want anything else. He's fat already, Nick giggled. When he steps into the barge, he says it rocks like a cradle. It will tip up one day. I was shocked. We would never even whisper such a thing in court. That's treason, I told him. It's true, though, Nick giggled again, and Meg laughed with him. And then the old grandmother put in her coarse belly laugh too. Sarah Downey looked from one to another of them and back at me. I was still uncomfortable. I glanced round, half expecting to see people in the shadows, dangerous, listening lords of the court, and I ducked my head and allowed myself a quick smile. We were sitting on the stools, pulled up so close around the fire that my legs and face felt scorching hot. Behind Widow Susan, I could see an old dresser looming into the shape out of the shadows. There was another black cooking pot on it, and some wooden bowls and cups, and a few spoons. Piled up next to it was an interesting heap of objects, and on top of them all a strange, staring head with large holes for eyes. I couldn't make it out properly, and the rest was flickering in the firelight, but it intrigued me. My eyes kept flicking back to it. What's that? I asked at last. Nick jumped up and picked up the head. It's my dragon, he said. I made it myself out of rushes and straw, and I'll wear him myself for the Murmur's play at Christmas. What do you think of him? He took off his cap and pulled the straw dragon's head on over his face, and then he picked up the bundle of rushes and shook it out. It became a full-length cape of green and sand and amber colours, crinkling and rustling like reeds on a riverbed. He slipped it over his shirt and began to dance, thrusting his head and arms out and hissing in a scary way. Meg clapped and her grandmother chuckled. There now, a bit of cheer for the young lord. Fetch your good man, Sarah Downey, and Buttons the Fletcher at the corner house. I've got good ale for them if they can come and play for us. Sarah passed the baby to bed and ran out. A few minutes later, she came back in with the man I'd seen carving wooden spoons outside the cottage next door. He grinned at me again, and I ducked my head. I wasn't used to that. Grinning so you showed all your teeth, like a ploughboy in the fields. No one did that in court. I was used to simpering. Another man with tight hair like blackberries stooped in carrying a fiddle and his wife followed him. Now the little room was crowded. Meg passed round jugs of ale and Nick put his dragon's head back on. Jack Downey pulled a carved wooden flute from his belt and half of it disappeared into the red bush of his beard as he put it to his mouth and began to play a jig on it. I knew the tune, The Merry Haymaker. In our old Montague Hall, we used to dance to it at harvest time, when all the peasants would be brought home for a feast, and the music played all night. The rafters would be hung with sweet-smelling apples, and they would bob and swing with the dancing. Long ago, before our world went grey. The Fletcher picked up his fiddle and held it against his chest, bowing it briskly so it let out a yowl like a cat. Then he turned towards Jack and danced his fingers along the neck of the fiddle, making it sing the same tune as the wooden flute, and then changed his tune to a harmony. They smiled with their eyes at each other as they played, because they knew all the old tunes and loved to make music together. The 7 joins of Mary then started, and I knew the dance for it would be Stripping the Willow. Clap, 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 went the woman, and the Fletcher's wife began to dance, and caught Meg's hand to make her dance too. Their skirts swirled, sweeping the grasses on the floor into dusty piles, puthering the smoke from fire into dancing ghosts. I even found myself shifting my feet from side to side in time to the music. I was back in the hall. Matthew was whooping and clapping and laughing with all the farm workers. My mother and father were swinging around together. My sister's eyes were bright with fun and pleasure as she watched and jigged from foot to foot, and Ned Porritt was standing proud next to his father, pumping a pair of bagpipes under his arm. But my dream dissolved, and I was standing cold and lonely among strangers. I longed for it all to be over. All I wanted was to be on my way to Greenwich to tell Lord de Courcy about my father.